In the past few weeks, something unusual has been happening around a figure who once seemed carefully protected by image, access, and silence. It did not begin with a single headline or a dramatic announcement. Instead, it started with small pauses, missed appearances, quiet cancellations, a noticeable absence from places where visibility was once constant. At first, these changes felt easy to dismiss. Public lives are busy, priorities shift, attention moves on. But then, the pattern became harder to ignore. Behind the scenes, conversations began to change, not loudly, not publicly, just enough to suggest that something was no longer working the way it used to. Brands slowed their responses. Advisors stopped returning calls as quickly. Familiar support structures appeared to loosen, almost cautiously, as if waiting to see what would happen next. This is usually how larger stories begin, not with proof or accusation, but with uncertainty. According to public commentary, questions started circulating online about recent business decisions and unexplained reversals. Some observers noted that partnerships hinted at months earlier never materialized. Others pointed to sudden shifts in messaging that felt reactive rather than planned. None of this confirmed anything. There were no official statements, no filings made public, nothing concrete to point to. Still, the silence itself became part of the discussion. When high-profile figures go quiet, it rarely happens without reason. In many cases, silence is strategic. In others, it signals that something unexpected has entered the picture. What made this moment different was how quickly that silence spread outward. It did not remain contained to one person or one project. It touched advisors, collaborators, and industries that typically operate with careful distance. At this point, many people started asking questions, not about guilt or wrongdoing, but about pressure, about sustainability, about whether the image being presented could still be supported by the systems behind it. Nothing has been officially confirmed, no formal explanation has been offered, but the growing sense of tension suggests that this is not a passing moment. It feels like a situation still unfolding, one that has not yet reached its clearest point. And as with many stories that unfold this way, the most important details may not come from announcements, but from what quietly stops happening next. To understand why this moment has drawn so much attention, it helps to look at how the public image was built in the first place. In this fictional universe, the figure at the center of the discussion rose quickly through a mix of visibility, narrative control, and carefully chosen partnerships. From the beginning, the appeal was not based on one achievement, but on the promise of many things at once: style, influence, access, a sense of modern relevance layered over traditional prestige. For several years, that image appeared stable. Appearances were frequent and coordinated. Coverage followed predictable rhythms. When criticism surfaced, it was often framed as misunderstanding or bias and then moved past. Supporters and skeptics existed, but the overall structure held. The system around the figure functioned as intended. Much of that stability came from relationships with established institutions. These were not always formal contracts. Some were advisory roles. Others were informal arrangements that benefited both sides. A brand would gain visibility. An organization would gain attention. In return, the public figure gained legitimacy and reinforcement of status. According to public commentary, this approach relied heavily on momentum. As long as the image moved forward, questions stayed in the background. Projects did not need to succeed fully. They only needed to appear active. Announcements mattered more than outcomes. Plans mattered more than results. This is not unusual in high-profile environments. Many public careers operate this way for long periods. The challenge comes when momentum slows. In recent months, observers began noting a shift in how these relationships functioned. Invitations appeared less frequent. Public endorsements became vague. The language used by partners changed subtly, replacing confidence with caution. These changes were small on their own, but together they suggested a reassessment was underway. At the same time, the financial side of the image began to attract quiet attention, not because of confirmed losses or disclosures, but because of visible strain. Lifestyle signals no longer aligned as cleanly with publicized income streams. Projects announced with confidence did not produce follow-up evidence. According to online discussions, this raised questions about how sustainability was being maintained. It is important to note that no verified financial records have been released. There is no confirmation of wrongdoing or mismanagement, but perception matters, especially in spaces built on trust and exclusivity. Once doubts enter that space, they tend to spread quickly. Another element that shaped the background was the reliance on intermediaries. Stylists, consultants, assistants, and external managers played key roles in maintaining the public-facing operation. This created distance between the figure and the logistical details of daily execution. While this structure can protect a brand, it can also create blind spots. Some commentators suggest that these blind spots may have grown over time. As the operation expanded, accountability became harder to trace. Decisions were made quickly to maintain appearances. Corrections were deferred. Temporary solutions became routine. What followed only added to the confusion. When questions arose, responses were inconsistent. Some were addressed indirectly, others were ignored entirely. The absence of a clear narrative allowed speculation to fill the gap. Again, this does not indicate confirmation of any specific claim. It simply reflects how information ecosystems behave when clarity is missing. Meanwhile, the broader environment changed. Institutions that once prioritized visibility began prioritizing risk management. Public tolerance for ambiguity declined. Brands became more cautious about association, especially where reputation could be affected by unresolved questions. This shift matters because it alters the balance of power. When support systems begin to pull back, even slightly, the individual at the center feels it first through friction, delays, additional reviews, requests for documentation that were not previously required. By the time these signals become visible to the public, internal conversations have usually been happening for some time. That is why the current moment feels less like a sudden crisis and more like the surface expression of a longer process. This is where the situation began to change, not because of one event, but because multiple background conditions aligned. Momentum slowed, scrutiny increased, and the systems that once absorbed pressure began to apply it instead. Understanding this context does not answer every question, but it explains why the story continues to develop and why it cannot be reduced to a single headline or rumor. The foundation matters because whatever comes next will be shaped by what was built before. As this shift became more noticeable, discussion moved from background observation to active questioning, not the kind that accuses or concludes, but the kind that tries to understand how things reached this point. According to public commentary, the focus turned toward patterns rather than incidents. People were no longer asking what happened on one specific day. They were asking how a system that once seemed so controlled could begin to show signs of strain. One of the first questions centered on visibility. For years, the public figure had been everywhere at once. Appearances were frequent, images carefully timed, narratives clearly framed. Then, almost without announcement, that rhythm changed. Fewer appearances led to fewer opportunities to reset the story. In the absence of constant visibility, older questions resurfaced. Some observers pointed out that when visibility slows, scrutiny often increases. This is not because new information appears, but because existing information has more room to be examined. Small inconsistencies that once passed unnoticed begin to stand out. Timelines feel less clear. Statements made months apart no longer align as neatly. Another line of discussion focused on decision-making. According to online analysis, recent choices appeared reactive rather than strategic. Projects were announced and then quietly set aside. Messaging shifted tone without explanation. In environments built on confidence, this kind of movement can signal uncertainty even when no confirmation exists. At this point, many people started asking questions about internal dynamics. Who was making the decisions? Who was managing the day-to-day execution? And how much visibility did the central figure have into the operational details that supported the image? Again, there are no verified answers, but the structure itself invites speculation. Large public brands often rely on layers of intermediaries. This can create efficiency, but it can also distance leadership from consequences. When something goes wrong, responsibility becomes difficult to assign. Some commentary suggests that this distance may have grown over time. As the public profile expanded, so did the number of people involved. Assistants, advisors, consultants, and external partners all played roles. Each handled a piece of the operation. Few, if any, saw the entire picture. This leads to another question that has quietly gained attention. Sustainability. Maintaining a high-profile image requires resources, financial, logistical, and emotional. When income streams are unclear or inconsistent, pressure buoy. LDS behind the scenes, that pressure does not always show up as crisis. More often, it shows up as shortcuts. It is important to stress that this remains speculation. No official audits or findings have been released, but the discussion itself reflects broader concerns about how modern public figures operate. Image moves faster than structure. Expectations rise faster than support systems. What followed only added to the uncertainty. Reports surfaced, based on public sightings and industry chatter, that access was changing. Invitations that were once automatic required additional coordination. Requests that once received immediate approval were delayed. None of this was framed as rejection. It was framed as process. Process in this context can be a warning sign. It suggests that trust is being re-evaluated. Media coverage during this phase remained cautious. Language stayed vague. Stories referenced sources familiar with the situation or people close to the matter. There were no accusations, just careful distance. That restraint itself became part of the story. As these questions circulated, the central figure did not directly address them. Silence continued. This absence of response allowed interpretations to multiply. Supporters argued that privacy was being respected. Critics argued that clarity was being avoided. Both interpretations can exist at the same time. The key point is that the conversation shifted from admiration to analysis. Once that shift occurs, it is difficult to reverse. Analysis invites comparison. Comparison invites pattern recognition. Pattern recognition invites further questioning. By this stage, the story was no longer about any single rumor or claim. It was about whether the public image, as presented, could still be supported without adjustment, whether the systems behind it were still aligned, whether the pace of expectation had outgrown the capacity to meet it. These are not questions with immediate answers. They unfold slowly, and they often reach their clearest moments not through declarations, but through accumulation. This is why the discussion did not fade. Instead, it deepened. And as it did, certain recurring elements began to stand out more clearly than before. As attention deepened, some observers began noticing similarities between moments that once seemed unrelated. These were not dramatic revelations. They were quiet repetitions. The same types of delays, the same shifts in tone, the same explanations offered without detail. Over time, these repetitions formed a pattern that felt increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. This is where the sense of tension slowly increased. According to public discussion, one recurring element involved the handling of professional relationships. Early in the public rise, associations were framed as partnerships built on shared values. Later, the language softened. Relationships were described as temporary, exploratory, or evolving. In isolation, this language is common, but repeated often enough, it suggests instability rather than flexibility. Another pattern involved timing. Announcements frequently arrived just as interest seemed to be fading. Statements appeared only after speculation reached a certain volume. This reactive timing created the impression that messaging was responding to pressure instead of guiding the narrative. What made this more noticeable was the lack of follow-through. Initiatives were introduced with confidence, then left without visible resolution. Supporters waited for updates that never came. Critics pointed to the absence as evidence of disorganization. Neither side could confirm their assumptions, but the gap itself became significant. At the same time, industry behavior appeared to shift. According to commentary from people familiar with similar environments, institutions tend to quietly reassess risk long before taking visible action. They review histories, they examine patterns, they compare notes internally. By the time changes reach the public, decisions have often already been made. Some observers believe this process may be underway here, not because of any single confirmed issue, but because of cumulative uncertainty. In high-stakes industries, uncertainty can be enough to trigger distance. This distance does not announce itself loudly, it appears as additional steps, more paperwork, longer approval chains, fewer informal accommodations. These changes are subtle, but they reshape how access works. As access tightens, pressure increases, the system becomes less forgiving, small missteps carry more weight, temporary solutions become harder to maintain, the margin for error narrows. This is often the moment when internal strain becomes visible externally. Public commentary has noted signs of this strain: body language in rare appearances, defensive phrasing in carefully worded statements, an emphasis on control rather than connection. Again, none of this proves anything, but it contributes to a broader sense that the situation is no longer stable. What followed only added to the feeling that events were moving faster behind the scenes than they appeared on the surface. Rumors began circulating about private discussions taking place out of view, advisors reassessing commitments, partners reviewing terms, legal teams preparing for contingencies that may never be needed but cannot be ignored. These preparations are standard in high-profile operations, yet their existence suggests anticipation of risk. The narrative also became more fragmented. Different outlets emphasized different aspects of the story, some focused on image, others on business, others on personal dynamics. This fragmentation made it harder to form a single, clear picture, which in turn fueled further speculation. As the weeks passed, one thing became increasingly clear: whatever was happening was not contained to one area of life. It touched multiple systems at once: media, business, personal relationships, institutional trust. This convergence is what elevates a situation from rumor to ongoing discussion. When multiple systems begin reacting simultaneously, even quietly, it suggests that underlying conditions have changed. The story no longer depends on whether any single claim is true. It depends on whether confidence can be restored. And confidence, once shaken, is difficult to rebuild quickly. This is why the tension did not resolve itself. Instead, it settled into a kind of uneasy pause, the sense that something was being evaluated, that decisions were pending, that outcomes had not yet been determined. This pause is often the most revealing phase of any unfolding story. It is when people watch closely, not for announcements, but for behavior, for who stays, for who steps back, for what continues and what quietly ends. As this phase continued, attention began shifting outward, not just toward the central figure, but toward the broader response forming around them. As the situation continued to unfold, the focus gradually moved beyond the individual and toward the response forming around them. This is often the stage where a story gains weight, not because of new facts, but because of how institutions, media, and the public begin to behave differently. Public reaction remained divided, but more measured than before. Supporters urged patience and restraint, pointing out that no official findings or statements had been released. They emphasized that speculation can take on a life of its own, especially in environments shaped by constant commentary. Critics, meanwhile, argued that prolonged silence invites scrutiny and that unanswered questions naturally lead to concern. What stood out during this phase was not outrage, but caution. Media coverage reflected this shift. Articles became more analytical and less celebratory. Language softened. Phrases like developing situation and ongoing discussions appeared more frequently. Rather than repeating claims, outlets focused on process, on what usually happens when high-profile arrangements are reassessed, on how industries protect themselves when uncertainty grows. According to public commentary, some institutions appeared to take quiet steps to limit exposure. This did not involve public statements or visible breaks. Instead, it showed up in policy. Invitations were reviewed more carefully. Informal privileges were replaced with formal requirements. Standard procedures were applied without exception. In many cases, this is not punishment, it is protection. Large organizations operate on precedent. When questions arise, even unconfirmed ones, they often respond by reducing discretionary risk. This ensures that if developments take an unexpected turn, they are not caught unprepared. These actions are rarely personal, they are procedural. At the same time, the pace of online discussion slowed slightly, but did not disappear. Instead of rapid speculation, longer threads appeared. People revisited past interviews, past projects, past statements, not to accuse, but to contextualize, to see whether earlier moments aligned with the present situation. This type of review can feel unsettling for anyone in the public eye. It reframes familiar material through a new lens. Moments that once seemed minor are re-examined. Decisions that were once praised are reconsidered. This does not mean those decisions were wrong, but it changes how they are understood. Institutional silence during this period became noticeable. No endorsements, no defenses, no clarifications. This absence can be interpreted in many ways. Some see it as neutrality, others see it as distance. In reality, it is often a sign that evaluations are ongoing. According to observers familiar with similar cases, institutions rarely speak while assessments are incomplete. Statements create obligations. Silence preserves flexibility. Meanwhile, public expectations continued to evolve. Early curiosity gave way to a desire or resolution, not necessarily judgment, but clarity. People wanted to understand whether this was a temporary recalibration or a longer-term shift. This desire for clarity is where tension often increases. When answers are delayed, imagination fills the gap. Even responsible coverage can only go so far without direct input. Yet no formal response came. Instead, subtle signals continued, advisors reportedly adjusting schedules, communications becoming more controlled, appearances becoming more selective. Each of these decisions, on its own, is reasonable. Together, they suggest a strategy of containment. Containment does not imply wrongdoing, it implies awareness of risk. At this stage, the discussion also began to include broader questions about modern public life, about how images are built, about how quickly success can outpace structure, about how systems designed for visibility handle moments of uncertainty. These questions resonated beyond the specific case. They reflected a growing awareness that high-profile narratives are fragile, that they depend on cooperation across many layers, and that when even one layer hesitates, the entire structure feels the strain. This broader framing shifted the tone of the conversation. It became less about personal judgment and more about systemic pressure, about what happens when expectations remain high but support becomes conditional. The public response mirrored this complexity. There was no single dominant narrative. Instead, there were parallel interpretations unfolding at once. Some believed the situation would resolve quietly, with adjustments made behind the scenes. Others believed it marked the beginning of a longer period of retreat and reassessment. What followed only reinforced the sense that the story was not nearing its end. Even without announcements, the absence of certain developments spoke volumes. Deals that would normally be confirmed remained unaddressed. Appearances that would typically be scheduled did not appear. Silence extended longer than expected. In media and institutional settings, extended silence often signals that outcomes are still being negotiated, that multiple interests are involved, that decisions carry consequences beyond one individual. As this phase continued, it became clear that whatever the final outcome might be, it would not arrive suddenly. It would emerge gradually through accumulation, through what resumed and what did not, through which doors reopened and which remained closed. This is why the story continued to hold attention, not because of dramatic claims, but because of unresolved movement, because people could sense that a transition was underway, even if its shape was not yet visible. And in moments like this, the question is no longer what happened, but what happens next. As the weeks passed, one thing became increasingly clear. The discussion surrounding this situation was not fading because it was no longer tied to a single claim or event. It had become a broader question about durability, about whether a carefully constructed public identity could adapt to changing conditions without losing its foundation. This is why the story continues. In many high-profile cases, attention moves on quickly once the initial curiosity is satisfied. That has not happened here. Instead, interest has settled into a slower, more persistent form. People are watching for signals rather than statements. They are paying attention to what quietly resumes and what remains absent. According to public commentary, the absence of clear resolution has created a vacuum. In that space, interpretation becomes ongoing rather than reactive. Each new development, or lack of one, is weighed against previous expectations. The narrative does not reset, it accumulates. Part of this persistence comes from the way modern public figures operate. Image today is not static. It requires constant reinforcement. Visibility, validation, and institutional support must align regularly. When any one of these weakens, the imbalance becomes noticeable. Observers have pointed out that rebuilding confidence is more difficult than building it initially. Early success benefits from novelty. Later stages require consistency. Adjustments that might have gone unnoticed before now carry greater significance. Another reason the story continues is that it intersects with larger themes: trust, transparency, the limits of narrative control. These themes resonate because they extend beyond one individual. They reflect broader changes in how audiences engage with public figures. People no longer consume stories passively. They analyze patterns, they compare timelines, they share interpretations. This collective analysis keeps discussions alive even in the absence of official updates. At the same time, institutions move slowly. Reviews take time, decisions are layered, outcomes are rarely immediate. This delay prolongs uncertainty, which in turn sustains attention. Some commentators suggest that the current phase may represent a recalibration rather than a collapse, a period where expectations are being adjusted on all sides. That outcome remains possible. Others believe the silence signals deeper challenges that cannot be resolved quietly. Both views exist because there is no definitive information to settle the debate. What is certain is that the situation has altered how the figure is perceived. Even supporters acknowledge that something has shifted. The tone of defense has changed from celebration to caution. The emphasis has moved from expansion to preservation. This shift matters because it shapes what comes next. Future opportunities will be evaluated through this new lens. Past assumptions will no longer apply automatically. The story also persists because it involves momentum that once seemed unstoppable. When momentum slows, people want to understand why. They look for explanations that make sense of the change. Until a clear explanation emerges, the question remains open. In many ways, this is the most uncomfortable phase of any public reassessment. There is no conclusion to respond to, no statement to analyze, just a waiting period filled with inference. This waiting period tests patience, it tests loyalty, it tests the strength of the structures built over time. As observers continue to watch, they are not waiting for drama. They are waiting for direction, for a signal that clarifies whether this chapter is closing or simply pausing. Until that signal arrives, the story remains active, not because of noise, but because of unresolved movement. And as attention slowly shifts toward reflection, the conversation begins to change once again. As the conversation reaches this stage, it begins to slow down and turn inward. The tone becomes less about prediction and more about meaning. People are no longer trying to guess the next headline. They are trying to understand what this moment represents. From the outside, it may look uneventful. No announcements, no confrontations, no visible turning point. But this quiet phase is often where long-term outcomes are shaped. It is where reputations either stabilize or continue to drift. According to public commentary, what remains most striking is not what has been said, but what has not. In an era where explanations are often immediate, extended silence stands out. Silence can be intentional. It can also reflect uncertainty about what to say without making things worse. For the public figure at the center of this story, the path forward likely depends on choices that are no longer performative. Adjustments may need to happen without cameras, without press releases, and without guarantees of immediate recovery. This is not unusual. Many public careers experience moments where recalibration is necessary. Some emerge stronger, others become more private, others slowly fade from prominence without a single defining end. What determines the outcome is not one response, but a series of small decisions made over time. The audience, meanwhile, continues to watch with measured interest, not with excitement, but with attentiveness. They are aware that stories like this do not resolve cleanly. They unfold in stages, sometimes quietly, sometimes unevenly. There is also a growing recognition that not every situation produces clear answers. Some remain ambiguous, some resolve behind closed doors, some never fully resolve at all. That does not mean they lack significance. In this case, the significance lies in the shift itself, in how quickly conditions can change when confidence weakens, in how interconnected public image, institutional trust, and narrative control truly are. As this chapter settles, the lesson may be less about one individual and more about the systems surrounding public life, about the limits of momentum, about the cost of maintaining an image without constant reinforcement, about how silence, once chosen, becomes part of the story whether intended or not. For now, the situation remains open-ended. No conclusions have been confirmed. No final judgments can be made. What exists instead is a pause filled with observation. And sometimes, that pause says more than any statement ever could. As the story continues, it will not be defined by a single moment, but by what gradually becomes clear in the weeks and months ahead.